This is a reading comp passage about King Arthur. This could be watched in conjunction with any question about the passage. Of course, each question is explained in its own video explanation. And I will say, if you're answering several questions about this passage, I would suggest answer all the questions first, then watch this video so that you're answering the questions with your own understanding of the passage. So let's look at this passage. It's a long one. The historical basis for the King Arthur legend has long been debated by scholars. So in other words, it's unclear to what extent we can view this as a historical fact, and this is something being debated. One school of thought, citing entries in the history of the Britons and Welsh annals, sees Arthur as a genuine historical figure, a Romano-British leader who fought against the invading Anglo-Saxons sometimes in the late 5th or early 6th century. So there are some people that think Arthur is a historical figure. It's unclear exactly the basis. There's some mention in these books of someone named Arthur who was some kind of leader. Now, does this mean that it was a King Arthur with the whole legend and paraphernalia along with it? Or was this just someone who happened to be named Arthur who was a lower level leader? So that's kind of tenuous evidence. The other text that seems to support, notice that word seems. The author is really a bit skeptical here. Seems to support the case for Arthur's historical existence is the 10th century Annales Cambriae. The latest research shows that the Annales Cambriae was based on a chronicle begun in the late 8th century in Wales. Additionally, the complex textual history of the Annales Cambriae precludes any certainty that the Arthurian annals were added to it even that early. They were more likely added at some point in the 10th century and may never have existed in any earlier set of the annals. So in other words, if the first information about King Arthur was added in the 10th century, 5 centuries after the fact, half a millennium after the fact, that is not very strong evidence for the historical basis of the Arthurian legends, for the historical basis of the King Arthur story. And so the author presents these and says, yeah, there's sort of evidence for these, but the author himself is clearly a bit skeptical about these things that purport to be evidence for historical King Arthur. Now, this next paragraph is a long one. It's been split on 2 screens. The lack of convincing early evidence is the reason many recent historians exclude authors from their accounts of post-Roman Britain. In the view of historian Thomas Charles Edwards, there may have been an historical Arthur, but a historian can as yet say nothing of value about him. Okay, so even if this guy was there, historian doesn't have anything to say about him, so that doesn't really make very good history. These modern admissions of ignorance are a relatively recent trend. Earlier generations of historians were less skeptical. Historian John Morris, apparently he's an earlier generation of historian John Morris made the putative reign of Arthur the organizing principle of his history of post-Roman Britain and Ireland. Even so, he found little to say about a historical Arthur. And so even the people that tried to make Arthur the center of things, even they did not have a whole lot to say about him. Partly in reaction to such theories, another school of thought emerged which argued that Arthur had no historical existence at all. Morris's Age of Arthur, the book written by the guy mentioned a couple sentences ago, prompted archaeologist Noel Myers to observe that no figure on the borderline of history and mythology has wasted more of the historian's time. So that is an extremely skeptical view expressed by Noel Myers. That is, not only did Arthur not exist, but he can't believe it's been such a waste of time that people have been fooled by this. So that's a very skeptical, strong statement there. The author goes on to say Arthur is not mentioned in any of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles or named in any surviving manuscript written between 400 and 820. So right there, that would be the first few centuries after he existed, and it's not mentioned at all in those. Also, he is absent from Bede's early 8th century ecclesiastical history of the English people, another major early source for post-Roman history. So all these texts that would seem to give evidence about the time none of them even mention Arthur. Now, of course, if Arthur had been a big king, if he had been king of all of England, of course he would have been mentioned in all these things. So this is all evidence that at least the idea of a big, King Arthur, king of all England kind of thing, that didn't actually exist, that has no historical basis. Some scholars argue that Arthur was originally a fictional hero of folklore, or even a half-forgotten Celtic deity, who became credited with real deeds in the distant past. They cite parallel figures such as the Kentish totemic horse gods Hengist and Horsa, who later became historicized. Bede ascribed to these legendary figures a historical role in the 5th century Anglo-Saxon conquest of eastern Britain. So in other words, these were beings that were originally purely mythological, but because they were so popular and they were discussed in stories, people started to talk about them as if they were historical figures, and actually Bede, who wrote this history, treated them like historical figures. And so the argument is, couldn't the same thing have happened with Arthur? Maybe Arthur was a mythological figure, and then as the stories became popular, it became treated more as a historical figure. Historical documents for the post-Roman period are scarce. Of the many post-Roman archaeological sites and places, only a handful have been identified as Arthurian, and these date from the 12th century or later. So in other words, one way to get history is what's written, and another way is archaeology, but archaeology is not giving any evidence for Arthur either. And any of the places that are clearly labeled with Arthur's name or have some connection with Arthur, these date from much, much later, the 12th century. So 700 or 800 years after the fact. Archaeology can confidently reveal names only through inscriptions found in reliably dated sites. In the absence of new compelling information about post-Roman England, a definitive answer to the question of Arthur's historical existence is unlikely. And so that's the end of the passage. And the author is saying, so there's not a whole lot of strong evidence for. We can't definitively say no. And so unless we get more evidence, unless magically some kind of new evidence shows up that we don't have yet, it seems like we're just not going to be able to answer this question. And that is the end of the passage.